Welcome to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live, where we offer the news, information, traffic, weather, sports, and entertainment our commercial drivers want and need. I'm your host, Shelley Johnson. History is one of the topics we like to cover, and the History of American Holidays by author Jeff Bensch celebrates America's history, culture, and patriotism with thought-provoking stories of the most popular holidays Americans celebrate. Jeff's been a regular guest on the show, and he's back with us today to discuss the history of Veterans Day, which is November 11th. That holiday acknowledges the contributions of our servicemen and women and their contributions to our country's national security. It's a day where we appreciate their service. Welcome, Jeff. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Yes, thank you, Shelley. It's always a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, you're a wealth of information. I love talking to you. You know, our veterans are so important and they need to be recognized. And I think it's wonderful we do have the holiday. What is the history of Veterans Day?
Yeah, well, Veterans Day really started as Armistice Day. And armistice is, I always wondered what it meant. And I actually had to go to the dictionary. I don't know if people realize that armistice is just a word and it means to stop fighting. Like a truce or a ceasefire during a war.
Okay.
And so Armistice Day, dates back to the ending of World War One.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all about the ending of the war, and it occurred at 11 a.m. on November 11th in 1918, the end of World War One, and it has great historic importance because of World War One and how it started, how it was fought, and how it ended. And so this holiday is really about history and world peace, what we'll find. And when you think about World War One, it's a lot of what we learned in high school, but probably forgot. And as our high school teachers always said, if you don't understand history, then you're condemned to repeat it. So I think now is a good time to review some of the history of World War One and how it leads up to Armistice Day and how that gets turned into Veterans Day.
Good idea. Yeah, I'm not sure everybody would remember the history of World War One. Of course, that was quite a devastating war. And there were a lot of veterans that came back. If they survived, they had a lot of disabilities.
That's right. World War One was basically brutal in the fighting, and the way they fought, and the extreme conditions. And it started in like about 1914 and was over by 1918, but it was hard fought, and we'll get into that a little bit. And it basically ended when people ran out of, soldiers and supplies, and it was like a war of attrition.
I was going to say, don't they refer to it as the war of attrition?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And in the terrible conditions, it was trench warfare. These people were just, they were living in such horrendous conditions for what, months at a time?
Oh, even longer. Yeah. But the way it started, though, is interesting, and it provides a lot of lessons for today. There's a number of circumstances in Europe that allowed the war to start the way it did. There's like four of them. One was military buildup. We had all these countries were building their militaries. And as you strengthen your military, you gain confidence that you can win. And when you think about it, no one ever starts a war thinking that they're going to lose. And
No
one even starts a war if they think it's going to take a long time. Everyone who starts a war thinks you're just going to go in and kick butt and get out of there. And of course, it's never that easy. But so in the early 1900s, these nations in Europe were all building up their military, and they gained this confidence. And then the nations also developed strategic defense alliances or mutual defense alliances, where they would say, hey, if you get attacked, we'll come to your side. And so that kind of set up the dominoes. And then they all had these imperialistic aspirations that they wanted to take over other nations and acquire other lands. The whole colonial thing with Great Britain and France and Germany. Kind of drawn lines on the world map. Russia too. And then the fourth thing was this nationalism, and this is a sort of, it's one thing to have pride in your nation and all that, but when you kind of take it to the extreme where you're sort of pounding the chest, I'm better than you are, and to prove it, I'm going to, teach you a lesson kind of thing. That sort of nationalism mentality was also prevalent in the early 1900s. So then you had sort of this thing, this little keg that's ready to explode. And in 1914, Bosnia wanted to be part of Serbia, but it was under Austrian-Hungary control. And the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was in Serbia, and he was assassinated by this Serbian nationalist sort of terrorist group, if you will. But following the assassination, Hungary declared war on Serbia. And then Russia had a mutual defense alliance with Serbia. So Russia came to the aid of Serbia. And then Germany had a mutual defense alliance with Austria and Hungary. And so Germany declared war on Serbia and Russia. And then France and Britain were Russian allies at the time. So there you had it. It was kind of game on. Everyone was in the war. So it escalated quickly. And then America tried to stay out of the war.
Yeah, we were isolationists then.
We certainly were. And we tried our best to just, stay out and let other people, settle their differences. But in around 1915, Germany sank a UK ocean liner that was coming from New York City on its way to London, I believe. But in sort of British waters, a German submarine sank the ocean liner, and 128 Americans were killed. So that's sort of got our attention. And then, and then they were sinking a lot of ships through there because we were shipping oil and other kinds of supplies to help the war effort, Great Britain and France. But then we'd also get word of the German atrocities of war, because the German soldiers were doing all kinds of mean, nasty, and ugly things to civilians in Belgium and French villages. Really horrendous, and that would make the U.S. newspapers, and so we were getting angry about that. And then we intercepted a communication between Germany and Mexico, where Germany was asking Mexico to attack America. So enough said with that, I guess. We didn't like Germans for doing that. And then some will say this is the biggest reason, but J.P. Morgan and all the Wall Street guys had loaned a ton of money to Great Britain and France. And if they had lost the war, it could have bankrupted America. And so Wall Street basically lobbied Woodrow Wilson to get involved. And America finally did get involved in 1917. And it was right around that time that also that Russia was going through their great upheaval, because the war depleted so many resources that folks were kind of starving, their food lines, and it sort of ignited the way for the Bolshevik Revolution. And then when Vladimir Lenin took over in late 1917, one of the first things he did was get out of the war. He signed a peace agreement with Germany, and so for Russia, the war ended. pretty quickly. And then for Germany, it did too. The war ended in 1918, and Germany basically had to give up because of attrition. As we were talking about it was such a hard fought war with trench warfare. Poisonous gases were being used.
Yeah.
And it was just brutal. And as they were running out of supplies, food, and yeah, I mean, soldiers were being sent to war without even guns or bullets. They were just supposed to pick up, what the fallen soldiers had left behind.
They'd pick up their dead comrades' guns and continue. And a lot of them didn't have proper training, I think.
That's true. Yeah. Generals included sometimes. Yeah.
Oh, that's never good.
Yeah.
No.
But they were, I guess it was really hard to count all the casualties, but you can find references to numbers all over the place. But the best kind of data I saw is about 8.5 million total military deaths. And then the U.S. sent over 1 or 2 million soldiers, but we only suffered 117,000 casualties. That's small compared to what the rest of the world went through.
Didn't World War One sort of level the playing field between the socially elite and royalty and the common man because they fought side by side?
I didn't really come across that, although it was during this whole time period that the economies were so distorted in terms of wealth distribution. And it's definitely what happened in Russia, where the Bolshevik Revolution was primarily a rise of the proletariat, I guess, the working class. So,
well, Tsar Nicholas was pretty clueless on what was going on, and I believe the Mensheviks briefly had control, and then the Bolsheviks, who were much more radical and violent, they ended up finishing the revolution.
That rings a bell. That it started out, it was very similar between those two parties and what they aspired. But yeah, the Bolsheviks are the ones that basically assassinated was Tsar Nicholas and
his entire family. Oh, that was so creepy.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't want any more royalty.
Yeah, that's right. They did. They wanted to level the playing field and distribute things equally. When you think about it, it's all about the wealth and and not maybe so much the power, but back then it was just like food and shelter, especially after World War One.
Oh, sure. And what's interesting is the Romanov family, even though there had been the war, they couldn't go to relatives in other countries that had been allies. They were rejected. The families didn't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah, I can see why. Yeah.
So, I mean, it left them in a terrible place. I mean, obviously they were held hostage and all of that and eventually executed. But there was so much conflict and a lot of change going on in the world, like you said.
That's true. Russia had been in a number of wars, with Japan and again over on the Western Front, even in the early 1900s. Early 1904, 1905 timeframe. And you read about it and you're kind of like, boy, they just kind of went from one war to the next. Russia's really had a tough time with either people invading them or them trying to take over other folks. And boy, it's one of those today, when you think about it, it's one of those lessons, right? If you don't understand history, you're going to repeat it. And
sure.
Here we are today.
Yeah. Oh, most definitely. But certainly the soldiers in World War One on all sides, it was a hellish war. And people came back heavily scarred, not only physically, but mentally. Isn't that when the first term of shell shocked came into play?
I'm not sure of that, but it would make sense. You're mentioning the returning home. The other thing with World War One was the Spanish flu. It was basically an influenza flu H1N1 virus, but
Yep.
it turned into pandemic, and um, it, it kills far more people than the war did. It killed
Hmm.
50 million people
Yeah.
worldwide.
And the soldiers actually spread it around when they went home.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's called the Spanish flu, but it really started at a hog farm in Kansas. And a lot of these viruses come from animals, of course. And there was a military training base nearby, and the soldiers there contracted the virus, but then they're shortly thereafter shipped to the battlefields, and then it spread to soldiers on both sides. So they're battling the flu in addition to all these other things we've talked about in trench warfare.
Hmm.
And then wounded soldiers took the flu home with them, and
Yep.
it spread worldwide. So people were in poverty. They were trying to pay for the war. Their countries were going in debt. It was hard to get food, and they were sick with the flu.
That was devastating. I don't think they knew that it was a virus. I think they thought it was bacteria because if I'm not mistaken, I don't think microscopes could see viruses at that time.
Yeah, I'm not sure the medical history of it, but uh, I do know that the pandemic spread a little bit worse than it would have because the warring countries didn't want people to know about it
Yep.
because they didn't want to be any they didn't want the other side to have knowledge of their weakness of half their
Hmm.
soldiers being sick or whatever. And Spain was neutral at the time, and so their newspapers did all the reporting
Yep.
of the flu, and so that's how it became the Spanish flu.
So they get the moniker and the blame essentially, and they were the
Yeah,
ones trying to let everybody know what the heck was going on.
yeah, exactly. And we kind of lay low under the radar there, I think. But they traced it all the way back to Kansas. Uh,
Interesting. I didn't know that, and so it must have come from pigs.
yes, yeah.
Huh.
Mhm. A lot of these viruses do, the
Yeah.
different pandemics,
Sure.
and that is something about pandemics. You mentioned what they knew then and now. But people have been studying, these diseases and everything for the longest time and developing vaccines, uh, and whether it's for the mumps, polio, the bubonic plague, the list goes on. And even the COVID vaccine, they'd been studying that, the whole RNA vaccines. They were discovered back in the 1960s, and the mRNAs were developed in the 1970s, and they were actually used to stop the Ebola crisis, and with great success. And so I think sometimes people today even say, well, how could they invent the COVID vaccine so quickly? And it's like, well, they were 80-90% of the way there. They're just waiting
Yeah.
for the virus to be well defined, and then um, it's not like it's easy or anything, but it's not like they started from ground zero either. I mean,
Right.
we're very fortunate. We live in a world where science is so uh, well developed. We can develop these vaccines on a fast track when we
Sure.
need to.
And when you think about it, World War One, that I don't think they had any vaccines or if they were widely used, because even smallpox was a devastating disease well into the
Mhm.
1920s. So,
Yeah,
and maybe even the 30s.
yeah, and a lot of these vaccines, I, I I don't remember the dates of this, but the uh, the vaccines were kind of developed actually, like, I forget what plague it was, but someone from Africa was talking with a doctor in the United States and said, well, if you sniff some of the flakes off the scab of a sick person, then you won't get sick. And that's pretty hard to understand and take that leap of faith that, okay, but it's basically give me a small dose and I'll let my immune system um, respond to that small dose. And
Right.
so some of those first doctors, were like, had to develop the idea of here, let me give you the disease so you get the disease.
Yeah, that there was a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
Well,
But
modern medicine wasn't necessarily received well in all communities, depending. So, yeah.
yeah,
Oh, all
it's
kinds of challenges. And certainly our soldiers and veterans were caught up in the middle of it, and war only made a lot of that worse. I know we've kind of digressed a little bit here, but it's interesting all the different factors that go into war and what our soldiers do for each and every country they work for and serve, certainly. We have to go to break here, but I want to unpack more about Veterans Day, Jeff. You're a wealth of information. I'm talking with Jeff Bensch. He's an author and historian. He wrote The History of American Holidays, and we're talking about Veterans Day today here on the Truckers Network radio show. Stay tuned for more coming up.
The trucking industry keeps America running thanks to the 3.36 million professional truck drivers who deliver everyday goods to 80% of American communities who rely on trucking for that last mile. The industry represents a diverse group with nearly half of drivers at 42% as minorities. Trucking Moves America Forward, or TMAF, educates the public on the essentiality of trucking by telling the story of trucking and its positive impact on our economy, communities, and lives. Learn how you can join the industry movement by visiting truckingmovesamerica.com.
Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with historian and author Jeff Bensch. He wrote The History of American Holidays. We're discussing Veterans Day and its history today. There's so much that goes into Veterans Day. We were just talking about World War I, which is a story in and of itself. What else is that you have about Veterans Day and various other historical facts, Jeff?
yeah. Well, I was going to go back to World War One and the end of the war, the lessons we learned on its ending, and like we said, it was a long, brutal war, exhausting battles, trench warfare, poisonous gases, the Spanish flu,
Yeah.
and Germany finally had to surrender. And the armistice was signed in 1918, as we mentioned. And then the Treaty of Versailles officially ended the war in 1919. But the treaty put significant restrictions on Germany. After the surrender, they had to surrender all of their outlying colonies that they had somehow had possession of. Like a lot of them were in North Africa, Tanzania, Cameroon. Some were in the South Pacific, Samoa, and many Micronesia islands. They had to give all those back, and basically France and Great Britain divvied them up, which is kind of interesting in of itself. That's a tangent that these countries in Europe took a world map and basically drew lines and said, you get this, I get that, like without regard to who's even living there.
Sure.
But that's the way it was back
And
then.
that doesn't work well in the future.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But then Germany also had to give back the territories of land to France and Poland on their borders. So it limited Germany's boundaries. They were forced to reduce their military size and keep it low. And then they had to make war reparation payments. So they basically had to pay everybody back in terms of dollars or money for the war. And it really affected Germany's economy for decades. And then they had to basically acknowledge and accept guilt for the war and take the blame for World War One. And so it was a lot. And the treaty was basically revengeful in a sort of way and humiliating for Germany. And in fact, the Treaty of Versailles is sometimes called the Treaty of Revenge. And it's sort of like left Germany behind. And when you think about revenge, it's basically when you hurt someone who's done you wrong, and it's basically to make yourself feel good. It's kind of a human nature kind of feeling, but it's not necessarily a productive action, and it kind of falls into that category of a animalistic feeling that we hopefully evolve to overcome. But sometimes people are like, well, you need it to teach someone a lesson. And I kind of remember the words of B.B. King on one of his albums about, revenge. He says, it doesn't work. He basically said, it doesn't work. It just makes them a little smarter. So next time next time, well, I'm goofed up the quote. It just makes them a little smarter so you don't catch them the next time. And so, yeah, it doesn't really teach anyone a lesson, and it doesn't allow for reconciliation or
That's true.
future growth.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
it doesn't allow for forgiveness. And there was a lot of dissension and anger in Germany because their economy really suffered, didn't it?
right, immensely. They were having to pay back the rest of the world for the war that everyone was really involved in.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it is what happens, and I guess when you look at what happened after World War II, it led into after World War I, it led into World War II.
Yes.
So it does kind of backfire on you. And World War I taught us one of the main lessons is it's always better to rise above revenge to achieve a more lasting peace.
Hmm.
And you can look at this politically or personally. I kind of look at personal level. Oftentimes, I think about getting revenge and think, oh, that'd be great, but it's kind of impossible. For me, like when I'm driving, I think if someone cuts me off, I always wish I had a little gun on my front bumper that could shoot nails and give somebody a flat tire for cutting me off.
I'm sure there's some commercial drivers that have lots of thoughts. Yeah.
But let's face it, that if I did that, the guy'd spin out in front of me and I'd be in a crash too, right?
Yes,
So
that's true. Yeah, it
it
becomes a
doesn't work.
logarithm. For sure.
Um, but
Wasn't this the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations that Germany had to make, even though their economy was suffering? Wasn't that one of the reasons that Hitler was embraced and the Nazi Party was able to take power because the people needed food and money, and they saw this particular party as a way to get them out from under all of that?
oh, absolutely, yes. The main point is that the world sort of turned their back on Germany and left them behind,
Hmm.
and so they were kind of open or vulnerable to um, anything or anyone who would come along and help them out.
Yep.
And that turned out to be Hitler. Yeah.
They were
Uh,
looking for a miracle worker.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And an
And
opportunist, a very devilish, evil opportunist walked in.
mhm. Yeah. And you can think about that today in multiple cases where, like on a small level, if a kid is left behind, for instance, they're more susceptible to joining a gang
Yep.
and doing things like that. So, and you can just use that as food for thought and think about bigger organizations, bigger groups of people that may be suffering in one way or the other, and how they band together. And it's not as always the most productive way for them to, uh, you know, restore their quality of life. Let's just put it
Sure.
that way. Whatever it is they
Sure.
seek.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, certainly Germany ended up developing an us versus them mentality, and they were a superior race and nation and all of that. That was just pounded into their heads, and certainly the children and everything else. So, I mean, all of this evolved just from another war. You think about it, it's you really have to look at history to not repeat something or make it far worse.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. They were just primed to be told that they were better than everybody else.
Yeah,
They
because they
followed.
didn't feel that way. They felt really downtrodden by the rest of the world.
Right.
Hmm.
Exactly. And um, they were feeling, yeah, down, and they needed to hear a voice that would lift them up. And then
Yeah.
they followed that voice, and it didn't work out so well.
No, not at all.
Yeah. And Woodrow Wilson, after World War I, wanted a more conciliatory treaty that included, national self-determination, equal trade, equal arms reductions, but France and Britain didn't go for it. But I think now, after World War II, we did learn the lesson there for a little while. We had the United States help rebuild a lot of countries after the war, and extended the olive branch, and created the United Nations, for instance, all in the attempt to foster a more peaceful world. And that's sort of what it takes.
Was it originally the League of Nations, or was that prior to?
Yeah, I think he, if I'm remembering correctly, he did the League of Nations, and that was after World War I, but it didn't really take hold.
Right.
And then the United Nations after World War II did take hold.
Yes. With the headquarters in New York City, which is interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it still is today, the headquarters.
Yeah. We did learn a lot after both those wars. And then I was just going to say, like, we had the United Nations, and then we had everyone reduce their militaries, and the United States kind of came out as the only power with a huge military. And then there was Russia, of course. But we had NATO, and we were kind of like the military arm of NATO. And I find it a little bit interesting today where we talk about, well, the other countries aren't pulling their weight. We need them to have bigger military presence. But after World War I, we were fine with those countries not having big militaries.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so
well, even World War II, there were countries that were very restricted. Certainly Germany, one of them. And that's why they divided Germany, too. Wasn't that? I'd learned that was based on the hinterland theory, that whoever owned that entire property, if you will, I think it was based on the Roman Empire, they were a threat to the world because they could expand beyond their borders. They didn't want Germany to have that kind of power again.
That makes sense. I mean, I think that region is, set up for industrial production and agriculture as well. So that makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, if you have control of the breadbasket, food is power.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and our soldiers, all the way through the world, they have fought all of these battles. And that is something that I've always scratched my head and thought, to be out there in these battles, especially the traditional ways that they would fight, it had to go through a soldier's mind. Why the heck am I here? I didn't start this. And the people that they encounter in other circumstances, they might be friends with them,
Right. And that's World War I was the beginning of that, because prior to World War I, wars were glorious and noble. And then after World War I, they were horrific and morally wrong. And it is the soldiers coming back, and the atrocities of war being more common knowledge, reported in newspapers, etc. And it was after World War I, Armistice Day was such a big deal. Everyone was so happy the war was over, and Armistice Day was established in England and France in 1920 by burying an unknown soldier at the highest location in their national cemeteries. And the U.S. followed in 1921 by burying the unknown World War I soldier at the highest point in Arlington National Cemetery. So, and then Armistice Day became an annual commemoration by congressional resolution in 1926. And it was a holiday dedicated to world peace. The quote from Congress at the time, that I found anyway, part of their thing was Armistice Day, Thanksgiving and prayer and exercises designed to perpetuate peace through goodwill and mutual understanding between nations. So people at that time had really had enough war.
Mm-hmm. They
But
really were. They were fed up. And when
yeah,
World War II became a reality, there was resistance, certainly with the United States and everything. Um, it had to have been horrific. People had to feel like we're doing this again, you know?
yeah.
And there were families where multi-generations had been in both wars
Oh, I
as
bet.
soldiers. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And so Armistice Day became a national holiday in 1938, and then in 1948, following World War II, this guy in Alabama, Ray Weeks in Birmingham, Alabama, expanded his Armistice Day parade to include all veterans in the parade and to honor all veterans. And this became continued for many years, and Mr. Weeks became the father of Veterans Day. And then in 1954, the name was officially changed to Veterans Day. And then in 1968, the Holiday Act changed it to the last Monday in October. So we get the 3-day weekend. But after the first observance in 1971, the outcry was significant. I guess there's still enough World War I vets still around
Uh-huh.
that they needed it returned to the 11th day of the 11th month. And there is often a moment of silence observed at 11 a.m. on Veterans Day.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So, but it is all about peace. Um, you know, the Veterans Day is it seems that it can be celebrating or glorifying war, but it's really not. It's honoring our veterans for their extreme sacrifices, but also remembering the horrors of war and working toward peace.
And when you look back through history, there were some extraordinary sacrifices the soldiers made. And many of the injuries they had impacted their entire lives. And I'm kind of curious, speaking of that, when was the Veterans Administration formed? Was that after World War One, the VA?
Oh, I'm not sure.
Because certainly that was an organization where people were finally recognizing veterans and their needs. I know that the VA was around at least in the 1930s
Mm.
as a federal organization, but it was an arm of the government to finally provide care for our soldiers when they came back home from doing their service. And it certainly went through a lot of evolutions, as we know, and still has issues. But at least that was being done, because I don't know if governments, even worldwide, had an organization to take care of their veterans. People were kind of left to their own devices with disabilities that they never left the country with, you know?
Oh yeah, yeah. Once you go off to war, you're never the same,
Yes.
and that's why it should be avoided at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. Veterans throughout history, they come home and no matter how hard we try, there's so many that fall through the cracks. After Vietnam, it was really a shame that
Yes.
they came back as almost as villains because like we say, the atrocities of war were on our television screens, and then we kind of learned from that we never treat our veterans that way. And so now when they return, they do receive a little bit closer to a hero's welcome. Uh, but at the same time, mental health issues, drug addiction issues, and homelessness among veterans is, at rates that are far too high.
Yes, absolutely. It's and that's something that people are working to change, but it's still an ongoing struggle. When I mentioned shell shock in World War One, that eventually became what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. And I don't think that anyone had really addressed that as a condition, a mental condition, as a result of war until World War One.
Um, oh yeah, and even yeah, definitely. People didn't recognize it, and even today, it's anything sort of mental health related has a, too great a taboo associated with it, and therefore it doesn't get enough treatment and attention when it is needed. Um, but it is good that we're recognizing it now. Uh,
Finally, yeah.
yeah.
Well, and their organizations working to help the veterans and so forth, they really had to band together to fight for the benefits that they deserve for serving our country. They've made a sacrifice, and it's only right that the country makes a sacrifice back for their service, because without our veterans, they protect freedoms and protect our national security.
Yes, they do. And it'd be, we don't want to think of what it would be like without them, that's for sure.
Mm,
And um,
absolutely.
we try to do as much as we can. Um, and at the same time, they're often the kind of folks that um, want to handle their own problems. And it takes a little effort to uh, find them and give them a helping hand they need.
Sure. We have to go to break here, Jeff. I know that there's a lot more to talk about, but we do have to pay the bills. I'm talking with author and historian Jeff Bensch. He wrote The History of American Holidays. We're talking about Veterans Day. There's so much that really goes into this holiday. A lot of people don't think about. That's why this is a really important discussion for the holiday that's on November 11th. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. TNCRadio.live is proud to carry the Steve Summers Overnight Drive Show. TNCRadio.live is dedicated to commercial drivers. We offer the news, traffic, and weather you need, and the entertainment, sports, talk, music, and celebrity interviews you want to hear 24/7. We have original shows and trucker podcasts that feature some of your favorites, like Ice Road Alex Debogorski and America's Truckin' Sweetheart Marcia Campbell. TNCRadio.live is convenient and designed for professional drivers. The best part is we're free, and you can listen anywhere you are on the road. With just one tap, you can tune into Steve Summers and us right on your phone. Simply download our app by going to app.tncradio.live. That's app.tncradio.live. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with author and historian Jeff Bensch. He wrote The History of American Holidays. We've been talking about Veterans Day. Jeff, you said you had some points to ponder for Veterans Day. Some more
Yeah,
points?
exactly, Shelley. We kind of made it through all the way to present day, Veterans Day. And then I, I always like to think about things to ponder, and I usually put some quotes at the end of each section of my book just to kind of give you something to think about and maybe dive a little deeper or think through things a little more clearly as you're driving down the road. And, Veterans Day leaves us plenty to ponder, each year as we honor and celebrate our commitment to continued peace, among nations. But you think about it, that was the intent after World War One. But then we had World War II, and then we had the Korean War, and then we had the Vietnam War, and we had the Gulf War, and now we had the Iraq conflict and Afghanistan. And if you just go through our history, and just Google the list of wars that America has been in, it goes on and on and on. There's all these little wars and skirmishes we get in, and we have uh, bases all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we're always trying to balance, keeping the peace and, do you need to have this large military to keep the peace? Or as Teddy Roosevelt said, you have to walk softly but carry a big stick. And
Yep.
so I think there are no easy answers. As our leaders, our presidents, they have tough decisions, and they're always striving, for mutual economic prosperity. And peaceful coexistence among nations.
Sure.
We got a war going on right now, and we've done a pretty good job of staying out of it, but we've sort of been helping the good guys.
Hmm. So we're still regarded as the enemy from the people from Russia. From Russia's standpoint, I'm sure they resent what we're doing.
Oh yes,
Yep.
they'd like us to mind our own business, I'm
Hmm.
sure.
Hmm.
I mean, that even started before the war. They're trying to, not let us provide aid to Ukraine, and
Sure.
a few years ago.
There's a lot of saber rattling going on, and it makes it very, very unsettling for people. And as you said, we've had a lot of wars and a lot of military presence across the world for quite some time. There's an entire generation right now that was born and doesn't know of the United States not being involved in some sort of conflict
Yeah,
since
absolutely.
since 9/11.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a little bit George Orwellian, if I'm saying the word. The book 1984.
Yeah.
That had the perpetual wars going on,
Oh,
and
I watched the movie. What a strange movie. The people are eating and they just, there's a cafe that's bombed and they just, rearrange where they're seated and just continue eating. It's like, oh my.
yeah.
I wanted people to know where they can find your book. You are a wealth of information, and this has been a wonderful discussion on Veterans Day. And there's so many more things that we could talk about, the elements that go into it. But it's a very important holiday. And like you said, it isn't always recognized the way it should be.
Hmm. I agree. And, as we have these conflicts, I think as Americans, we can be proud, to be the leaders of peace and prosperity. I mean, we're trying our best all the time. And whether it's by skill or good fortune, America emerged from the world wars as the example of economic and military power through a society of individual freedom and self-rule and social equality.
Hmm.
Um, so I think we can be proud of that, and we can be grateful to our veterans for providing these opportunities we have. And you mentioned my book. It is kind of a fun read. It's a nice little gift book. It's very lighthearted, and it just provides a lot of these serious points in a storytelling fashion, so you can kind of think about them yourself a little deeper.
Hmm.
And it's available at Amazon and online and Barnes and Noble and pretty much any other book outlet,
And
online thing.
it's called The History of American Holidays.
Yes.
Hmm. Definitely a wonderful gift to give someone for Christmas. And I like the approach you have to history. You make it interesting rather than dates and maybe the way that a lot of teachers used to teach history where it was boring. It's not boring. You personalize it and you make it relevant because let's face it, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for history. I mean, it's just the way it is. This has been a wonderful discussion on Veterans Day, and I really do appreciate it. I'm Shelley Johnson. You've been listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.live. I've been talking with writer and historian Jeff Bensch, the author of The History of American Holidays. Check out his book. It's wonderful. Stay tuned for more great programming right here on TNCRadio.live. We've got lots coming up in our primetime lineup, so stay tuned for more coming up here on TNCRadio.live. Thank you for listening to another great interview on TNCRadio.live and the Truckers Network radio show. All of the material you hear on TNCRadio.live on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of TNCRadio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast of the Truckers Network radio show.